Hello, IMF friends. I'm going to give you a 15 minutes, my take on metropolitan governance. And as you well know, the world is becoming increasingly metropolitan. The pictures here is on the top, it's Kolkata, India, and below it's Vancouver, Canada. But the metropolitan trend is across the world. First, a few basics. What do we usually consider as a metropolitan area or a metropolitan region or city region? Well, it's a single economy and a labor market. This area usually include many local governments. And that means that it's a community with common interests and with opportunities for some joint actions. There are different ways to define the metropolitan areas. Some people like to just count the built-up area. More common is a certain distance from a center or a core city. For example, a area of 30 to 40 kilometers radius and about an hour travel distance. The way I usually define a metropolitan area is areas from which there is daily commuting to a core city of at least 10 or 15% of the working population. And that usually represent what we often call a functional economic area, and also a public services area in terms of where the major hospitals are and education facilities, and to which people may commute daily. Why would we focus on this scale? Well, you know as well as me, there is economies of scale to save cost of those local governments in the metropolitan area, if they would collaborate and coordinate. It's an area where you sometimes need to address spillovers in terms of impact by one area, one local government area to another local government area, and pollution is the typical one, but there are many other externalities as well. We may want to address equity concerns if some of the areas in the metropolitan area are much wealthier than others. And we can also become stronger in other ways by just acting jointly, for example, to attract investments or to mobilize financing. But we have to recognize that this collaboration or coordination may be needed at a different scale, not always the full metropolitan scale, depending on the topic. For example, the area for garbage disposal may not necessarily be the same area to address air pollution. And air pollution may even be an area beyond the metropolitan area. But within the metropolitan area, there are some topics which just need a smaller area for coordination and some across all the local governments. So what are we talking about in terms of coordination? And what opportunities are there for joint actions? Well, here is a list of the variety of things. And it's not only planning. It could be integration of service networks if the built-up areas are close enough to each other in terms of the integrated water networks. Public transport is usually a topic to be addressed at the whole metropolitan area. But there are a variety of areas to be addressed, like flood protection, emergency service, and tourism promotion. Get the tourists to get here and get them to stay longer And it doesn't really matter in which local government jurisdiction that they would spend most time. All of us will benefit from them being here. We may want to harmonize taxes or fees across the area and not compete on that particular topic, but rather compete on quality of service, for example. Or it can be a simple thing like joint procurement, anything from light bulbs to garbage trucks, or have joint training programs, or even apply for a loan jointly, the local governments in the metropolitan area. It's not a matter of either or, metropolitan or local government. Many functions, as I have listed on the left side, there may be aspects which we may want to address jointly. And then there also are other aspects which are most effectively handled at each local government level. Just to mention one of these, solid waste management, typical disposal. We want to plan and coordinate jointly with joint landfills or other facilities, while the garbage collection, each local government can handle. That doesn't have to be done jointly necessarily. I want to spend most time, though, on what are the ways we can govern this metropolitan area. And here are essentially 5 common buckets where we can classify different cases. The most simple one is simply to have an intermunicipal forum. We have the Metro Council, or an association of local governments, or sometimes it's called partnership. In Latin America, it's often called Mancomunidad. In Brazil, it's called a consortium. In the US, it's called Council of Governments. And in France, it's called Metropole, or now in English, Metropoles. At the end of the day, I tend to call it Metro Council. It's a forum for us different local governments to dialogue and discuss what we may want to do jointly. And usually the decision making is by consensus, or if there are any other ways, sometimes it's a decision making process which requires that the decision goes back to each local government for ratification or confirmation. I got a beautiful answer from a Japanese metropolitan area once. I asked them, how do you get agreements of what to do? And their answer was, well, we do what we can agree to, and what we can't agree to, we put aside. These simple metro council usually operate on consensus basis, but to address something jointly, there ought to be something in it for everybody, and therefore on different topics, it's not that difficult to achieve consensus. Then we find metropolitan authorities across the world, particularly for individual sectors, transport authorities, water authorities, waste authorities, where we local governments have joined forces to address these topics together. That can go one step further, meaning a metropolitan authority which is very broad-based, which may not only do planning and development and one or two services, but can address a variety of services. And an example of that is Metro Vancouver. More than 20 local governments, small local governments, essentially, you can say, delegate to the Metro Vancouver, which used to be a Metro Council, now it's actually a Metro Corporation, to address various sectors on behalf of the local governments. And each local government has a representative on their board. And they even have a joint human resource department for recruitment of staff. Then to be more ambitious, of course, we can create a separate metropolitan level government. And we would usually see that still as a local government, subnational government. Tokyo and Seoul, Korea, is typical examples where they, for selective functions, have created a separate metropolitan scale local government to address, for example, water, waste handling, etc. To have a pure second tier metropolitan level government, then we would look at examples in London, where the mayor of London has some authority over the various boroughs, and Budapest is a similar setup. Municipalities in China are two tiers, a municipal level, which tend to cover the metropolitan area, and under the municipal level we have county and district governments. If we really want to be ambitious, then of course we could try to create a consolidated local government at the metropolitan scale, meaning one local government covers its metropolitan area. I mean, that's easier said than done. If today we may have 10, 20 local governments in the area, but there are a few, not many, but one typical example is South Africa, where after the apartheid ended, then they created 8 large municipal governments, which each cover its metropolitan area. And it's one local government, but of course they have local offices for service delivery, but it's 8 large municipalities which are of metropolitan scale. Istanbul is another example which didn't amalgamate. They annexed a neighboring area and thereby became essentially its metropolitan area. It wasn't Istanbul itself who did it. It was the national government who decided to expand the area of the Istanbul municipal government. So through amalgamation or annexation, you can make a local government larger, and sometimes it covers its metropolitan area. Well, if we don't have any arrangement, then it tends to be by default that the provincial, regional, or state government steps in to try to manage or enforce certain coordination in a metropolitan area. For example, in Australia, the all public transport is actually managed by the state governments. And we can also view the state level development authorities in India as somewhat of a arrangement at metropolitan scale. And it's usually sectoral authorities like state level water authorities who is handling that sector at the metropolitan scale. But it's governed by the state government. In most of these arrangements, we can look at them a little bit more detailed, and we find that some of them are directly elected in terms of the officials or mayor, and sometimes indirectly elected, that each local governments in the area may elect the representatives at the metropolitan level. Then they vary in terms of authority. Some of these arrangements have more decision-making authority, and some are mainly of the advisory role. And most metro councils tend to be of an advisory role, and each local government council tend to have to take the final decision. The scope varies. Some of these arrangements are mainly for planning and coordination, and some, as I mentioned, are service delivery entities. And funding may differ as well. For example, the Metro Vancouver not only gets a membership fee from each local government, but also a piece of the property taxes from each of the local governments, and even a small piece of the road tax. So we find different arrangement on that dimension as well. Then I want to end with, in case we wouldn't have any arrangement, or we may want to start with the Metro Council. Well, how to get our local governments together to actually address things at metropolitan scale. It's usually helpful to initially focus on small things which have high probability of success, on non-controversial, low risk, or it has obvious cost benefit for everybody. Non-controversial, low risk can be as simple as create the joint institute to address some research at the metropolitan scale on cost benefit. Solid waste disposal can easily be calculated if it makes sense for us to do that jointly instead of each one having their own landfill, etc. A higher level government at the regional or national level can also provide an incentive to get us local government to cooperate more, and usually through conditional transfers. For example, in the United States, all the Metro Council, called councils of governments, were essentially created based on the federal government insisting that if you want federal money for transport investments or road investments, you have to create a metropolitan planning organization and come up with a metropolitan plan for that sector. And to get that federal funding, there were certainly enough incentives to create these metro councils. And later, the same conditional transfer approach was applied for sewage and wastewater investments based on federal money. Another influence can simply be the media or civil society, the public, emphasizing more on what could be coordinated or addressed at the metropolitan scale. And that can be influential and get local governments to arrange more jointly. At the end of the day, it usually proved effective to start with a light structure, because you really have to gain trust in the arrangement among the local governments to make it work. Because without commitment from each of the local government, it tends not to work particularly effective. But based on small successes and a non-complicated arrangement, more and more experience tend to be a snowball. And by that, I'll hope this may trigger questions for our discussion. And thank you very much for your attention. And I look forward to the whole IMF sessions during the various days. Thank you.